Hi everyone, welcome back, and welcome to Management Strategy Availability and Alternatives. So now you know how to identify the most optimal interruption management strategy for any given situation. Now if we could always be sure to just use the optimal strategy, then what you know would already be a perfect system. Unfortunately, no system is truly perfect, and the most optimal strategy in theory may not be the most practical or available one in real-life practice. So for this reason, it is important to understand the next best options and how to identify which strategy is the most feasible in the moment. So let's have a look at all of the possible combinations of our interruption properties again, and the strategies that we established were optimal in the previous lesson. Okay? So we have interrupt. We interrupt when the urgency is high and the cost is low. We negotiate when interruption urgency is low and the cost is high. We delegate anytime that the interruption urgency is high, the cost is also high, and relatedness is low. We can also do it if relatedness is high. Main thing is cost high, urgency high. And multitasking, it's never the optimal strategy, but it's possible and viable when the urgency is high, the cost is high, and the relatedness is also high. Relatedness is the key one when it comes to multitasking. If relatedness is low, you can't multitask. So let's start at the top of this list here with these scenarios. We have high urgency and low cost. Now it will always, almost always, be optimal to interrupt in this scenario, because negotiating is going to result in ignoring an urgent task, which results in way more negative outcomes. And multitasking is always going to result in a higher error potential for both tasks than interrupting, which only introduces an increased potential for error in the primary task, not in both tasks. So negotiating multitasking are totally out here. In this situation, the only possible alternative strategy is to delegate. Now sometimes, delegating is actually better than interrupting in high urgency, low cost situations. It depends on the availability of the delegate. So delegating by nature avoids the consequences of choosing to interrupt, because interrupting any task increases the risk for error by at least a little bit. But if you have to interrupt someone else in order to delegate, then the risk for error overall is the exact same as if you had chosen to interrupt yourself. So if a person is free and they're capable of performing the interrupting task, then great, delegating works better. But because you have to interrupt someone else most of the time in order to delegate, interrupting is usually the best here. Because why interrupt somebody else if you can just do it yourself? Same amount of error, way more annoyance. So here's an example of high urgency, low cost interruption. You're documenting a routine patient assessment when a patient in bed 2 indicates they quickly need help to the bathroom. This is about an urgency of 8, or the cost of 3, and a relatedness of 1. Now, if someone else is free and readily available to handle the patient in bed 2, then you should delegate. However, your task is relatively low cost, so if others are also engaged in other tasks, and let's face it, most of the time they are, the best decision would be to interrupt your documentation and to help the patient in bed 2. Negotiating is not possible here. You can't ask the patient to hold it. And multitasking is also out. It is impossible to document and help in the bathroom at the same time. You can't do it. So now let's take a look at the next scenario. Low urgency, high cost. As we went over in the previous lesson, this is by far the easiest situation to be in, because negotiating is always the most effective strategy when interrupting task has low urgency. It's the only strategy, in fact, where you can perform both the primary task and the interrupting task without the potential for error accumulating. Now, if the interrupting task can wait until you're finished with the primary task, you negotiate. You complete the primary task, and then you attend to the interrupting task afterwards. Unless you're in some kind of constraint to complete the task, negotiating is going to be your answer to low urgency, regardless of the other factors. And if you're under a constraint, then the interruption isn't low urgency anyway. It's going to be high urgency. So there is one reason that you wouldn't negotiate here, and that is if you are not proficient in the interrupting task. If the interrupting task is something that you're not confident doing, or that you know somebody else is going to be way better at you than doing, you should delegate instead. So we have a case for delegating, but multitasking and interrupting are basically out of the question. So as we've said before, multitasking is always a last resort option, so you should never do it unless you have to, and if the urgency is low, you don't have to. Interrupting in this scenario would just be completely foolish. You should never interrupt a high-cost task to attend a low-urgency one. It's the same as multitasking. If you don't have to interrupt, don't do it. So here's an example of a low-urgency interruption. You're assisting a patient with a shower when another nurse asks you if you can take another patient's morning vital signs. Right? So the urgency is going to be about a 1. The cost here is a 10, and the relatedness is a 1. So because the task is so non-urgent, it can wait to be completed until you're done assisting the current patient with their shower. So the best course of action is going to be to negotiate here. You leave the patient alone in the bathroom, that's out of the question. And it's impossible to do both tasks at once. So you know that if another nurse is available, or if they have another task on your list to do after this that you would rather not push back, you can also delegate the vital sign task to someone else. Just make sure that you're delegating here based on objective reasoning and not just because you don't want to do the interrupting task yourself. Delegating for selfish reasons can increase the overall risk of error, and that is exactly what you're trying to prevent. Totally pointless to delegate for selfish reasons. Come on. Now, as for bad strategies, interrupting would be absolutely disastrous here. You can't leave the patient alone in the bathroom. Cost clearly outweighs urgency here. As for multitasking, just plain impossible. You can't multitask these two things. Now we come to our third scenario, when urgency and cost are both high. In this situation, delegating is going to always be your best option. However, delegating has a few nuances to it that will determine exactly how you choose to delegate. So until now, we've been mostly assuming that the capabilities of yourself and others to perform tasks are pretty equal. Unfortunately, this is not the case in practice. There will be some tasks that are beyond you, and some tasks that only you can handle. And then there's everything in between. In the lesson about evaluating interruption properties, we talked about assessing task proficiency when assessing interruption urgency. So when it comes to delegating, you should have a pretty good idea of how proficient you are at the interrupting task, how proficient the intended delegate is at the interrupting task, how proficient the delegate is at the primary task, the one that you're currently doing, and obviously how proficient that you are at the primary task, since you're already in the middle of doing it. When delegating, you can do one of two things. You can either delegate the interrupting task, or you can delegate the primary task. You can give your primary task away. The ideal situation is to have the delegate handle the interrupting task, though, because handing off your primary task to another person is way more risky than having a delegate handle a totally new task. Delegating the interrupting task to a free person, as you can see in this graph here, results in no added error potential because no one's being interrupted. It's just primary task. Here's another primary task for you. No error potential, no interruptions. If you delegate to someone who's already in the middle of another task, then that results in a bit of extra error potential at the interruption queue because, well, you're interrupting somebody, and the basic rule of interruption states that you're going to have a little bit of extra error. It's not that much, but it is a little bit. Now, delegating the primary task midway through accrues a much larger amount of error potential because now you have to explain the primary task completion process to the delegate, hope that person understands you, increase their cognitive load for the task because they have to think about what you've already done versus what they have yet to do, and also increase the primary task break time and task timeliness of the interrupting task, all of which is leading to increased error. So altogether, although delegating the primary task is going to result in much more error potential than delegating the interrupting task, the only reason that you will ever want to delegate the primary task is if you are way more proficient at the interrupting task than the delegate is. So if the delegate that you've found that can do something for you can't do the interrupting task, but you can, that is when you have the delegate do your primary task and then you go off and do the interrupting task. So now we can get back into high urgency, high cost. Delegating, again, usually best. But there are times when delegating simply isn't an option. If you cannot delegate, the next best choice is going to be to multitask, because even though multitasking introduces some error potential, it ensures that both tasks get done as soon as possible and that neither task is waiting. Unfortunately, multitasking can only be done if the relatedness is high. When relatedness is low, you're going to have to choose between one of the two other strategies. Both will work in a pinch, but neither of them is going to work well. You will need to choose very wisely and use what you've learned over the past few lessons to evaluate the best course of action given your circumstances. And sometimes that's just life. So for this one, we can use an example from the last lesson. So let's picture that you're conducting a documentation on a critical incident epilepsy patient who's recently had an episode with the seizure patient's family members. Begin to ask about questions about the quality and direction of that patient's care. Last time, we assessed this to be an urgency of 7, a cost of 8, and a relatedness of 8. Now, the best case scenario here is for you to delegate. You have someone else answer the questions of the patient's family while you continue to focus on documenting the incident. If you are the person who knows the most about the patient in question here, though, then it's going to be the most appropriate and more helpful for the patient's family to hear from you. So in that case, the next best option is going to be to delegate the documentation task, your primary task, to someone else. And then you take the interrupting task of talking to the patient's family yourself. So if nobody else is around to do either one of those options, then the two tasks are related enough that you can multitask them if you really need to. For this particular scenario, you would not even want to consider interrupting or negotiating. Multitasking is possible if delegating fails, and both of these options are going to result in a much higher risk for error than multitasking or delegating. It'd be very, very bad to leave either one of these alone. Now, much of our discussion in this lesson has been focused on what to do if the optimal strategy for your situation is not available. So let's summarize here how to know whether or not a strategy is available. So for interrupt and negotiate, super simple. It's one question. Are you capable of performing the interrupting task yourself? If you can't perform the interrupting task, your only option is to delegate. You've got to give it away to somebody else. Now, delegating is the most versatile, but it's also the most conditional strategy. So the intended delegate, who is the person that you're giving away the task to, has to be capable of performing either the primary task or the interrupting task. Whichever of the two tasks you want to give away, that person's got to be able to do it. The intended delegate should also ideally be free of tasks. It's best to find a person who is not already in the middle of something else when delegating so that you are not interrupting them. Most of the time, though, as we've said, the candidate is probably going to be in the middle of another task. So if they're not free, then you should try to find someone who is in the middle of a low-cost task that they can interrupt well, or your interrupting task should be low urgency enough that they can negotiate it and finish whatever they're doing before they need to attend the interrupting task. If the intended delegate is not free, they can't negotiate, they got to be conducting a low-cost task. You don't want to interrupt somebody who is conducting a high-cost task, because that's just introducing way more error into the situation. So you got to think about what the other person is doing when you go to delegate. Basically, you need another person to be both available and capable of helping you. You also need to be conscious of what that person, that delegate, is doing. Now we come to multitasking. There are only two things for this. The two tasks just need to be compatible with multitasking. You've got to be able to do it in the first place. This is the relatedness measure. So remember the rules of relatedness. These will tell you if multitasking is possible. Also, same as interrupt and negotiate, you got to be capable of doing it yourself. If you can't do it yourself, if you can't do both tasks, you have to delegate. You can't do something that you're not able to do. So remember, just because multiple options are available does not make them good. After this lesson, you now have the tools necessary to make the best decisions to any interruption that you may encounter. The next step here is knowing when the time to make these decisions is and how to make sure that you execute your chosen strategy flawlessly. We'll see you in the next one.